Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're exploring Indigenous leadership in Australia. And specifically, we're going to be looking at how these leaders are navigating what researchers are calling two worlds.
It's a really interesting concept, but basically it's about how these leaders are bridging that gap between the systems and structures we usually see in Western society and then the distinct needs and the traditions of their indigenous communities. It's a tough balancing act for sure.
Absolutely. And to help us unpack all of this, we're looking at this super insightful research article. It's from the Australian Journal of Public Administration. And what's cool is it's not just theory. They actually interviewed a whole bunch of Indigenous leaders, from all over Australia.
Yeah, and it wasn't just people in elected office. The study looked at leaders working at the community level and in organizations, even people within government bureaucracy. So it's a pretty diverse group.
And here's another thing. Get this. The researchers actually, they partnered with the Australian Indigenous Leadership Center. It's called the AILC. They interviewed leaders who were actually part of their training program.
I can see why they would partner with the AILC for this. Their program is really unique. You're not just, learning those typical leadership skills. There's even a whole day in the program dedicated to healing from trauma.
Wow, that's amazing. It really highlights the depth of this leadership approach. So it's not just about hitting targets and climbing the corporate ladder. It sounds like it's more about deep, long-term change that starts with that personal healing and then ripples out to the community.
Exactly. It's like a ripple effect. You start with the individual and that healing process, and then those positive changes spread outwards.
So what would you say are the key traits, like the defining characteristics of this Indigenous leadership style? What did the researchers find?
Well, several things really stood out in those interviews. Patience was huge, and leading by example, always helping others. They were big on deep listening, like really listening, and then being able to communicate clearly. Now, those might sound familiar, like any good leadership philosophy, but what really set these leaders apart was their emphasis on community.
It's not just about leading. It's about leading with the community.
Yeah, exactly. And that can lead to, some friction when they're trying to work within systems that don't always share those same values. Like one leader in the study even said, and this is a direct quote, "They don't give us time. They don't ask us what we want. The white fellas just come and say, you have to do this program. You have to do it."
That's powerful. It really highlights that frustration when things are done in a top-down way.
Yeah.
It really underscores why genuine collaboration is so important.
Oh, absolutely. You see, traditional managerial models, a lot of times they focus on the individual. You got to hit your KPIs, got to climb the corporate ladder. But this research, it reveals this leadership style that's so deeply rooted in community well-being. And it's focused on those long-term changes, not just quick fixes.
It's about lasting impact. And speaking of that, there was this one quote from a leader that really stuck with me. They said, "You're not going to change everything overnight. If I've made a difference to one or two people, it'll have an effect on others. It'll grow." It says so much about their long-term vision.
Yeah, definitely. It really does. And I think it brings us to a crucial takeaway for any organization. Any organization that wants to genuinely collaborate with Indigenous communities, they've got to, first of all, understand this different way of leading. Then they have to respect it. And that might mean letting go of some of that need for control and building trust, and being more flexible.
So it's less about telling people what to do and more about, more about empowering those communities,
Right.
and empowering them to find their own solutions.
Yeah, exactly. It's about shifting that dynamic for sure. And that actually brings us to another fascinating thing about this research. It's this idea that this style of leadership, it's really connected to something bigger, a connection to the land, their ancestors, their culture.
That's a good point. It's not just about individual qualities. It's about tapping into something much larger than oneself,
Yeah.
right? This source of resilience, it's it comes from that connection to the land, their ancestors, and their culture.
Exactly. Like one of the leaders in the study said, "My spirituality, going home to my country every year, camping, fishing, sitting, and just soaking up that country, knowing the birth areas of my totem and kin is very important to me."
Wow. Yeah, that really puts it into perspective. It's about drawing strength from something bigger, way bigger than just, personal motivation. And it's not just about individual strength either, right?
Oh.
The study also talked about the role of family, like how important those support systems are.
Absolutely. Family and community, they play such a huge role. I mean, think about it. A lot of the leaders they talked about, their families, especially mothers and grandmothers, and how they instilled those values in them,
Yeah.
resilience, the importance of education. Those early influences, they can shape who we become as leaders, for sure.
It really makes you think, you know, those people in our lives who believed in us, those mentors, our families. But then in this context, there's this added layer of, having to navigate these different cultural worlds, which is tough. But it also seems to bring a unique kind of strength.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. You see, this research, it challenges how we usually think about leadership, like those traditional hierarchies. What we're seeing here, it's this leadership style that's less about your formal position and more about, stepping up, serving the community, being that bridge between different worlds.
Right, right. But that has to be a challenge sometimes, especially when you're dealing with, those organizations that have that top-down way of doing things. And it looks like the study even touched on that, like the tension that can create.
They did. It came up a lot, actually. Like one leader said, there's a mistrust. Are they ready to let go and let an Aboriginal person lead?
Hmm. That's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are those institutions, are they really ready to embrace a different way of doing things?
Mm.
To trust the expertise of those Indigenous leaders and to actually value that leadership style that puts relationships and community first.
It makes you think. It does. Imagine the potential, though, right? What if we could actually, bring those different approaches together, the impact that could have on policy,
Yeah.
on how we deliver services, on creating more inclusive workplaces? It could be huge.
Definitely. I mean, valuing and supporting Indigenous leadership, it's not just the right thing to do. It's smart. We unlock all of that knowledge, all of that lived experience. Everyone benefits from that.
Exactly. Because diversity in leadership, it's not just a nice to have, it's actually essential if we want to build a society that's more just, more equitable,
Yeah,
right?
totally. So how do these leaders, how do they actually walk that line between those two worlds? I mean, what are some of the things they do, their strategies?
Well, one of the key roles a lot of them take on is they become this conduit, almost like a translator. They're explaining those needs and perspectives of their communities to those government bureaucracies. And then they're explaining things the other way around. It's a lot.
Yeah. It sounds like they need some serious communication skills for that.
Oh.
And patience. Tons of patience.
It's not easy. And the research really highlights how tough it is. To constantly run into those walls, those people who just don't get it, who are skeptical, that has to be incredibly frustrating for them.
Yeah, I bet. So it's like they're constantly having to justify their knowledge, their methods, their whole way of approaching things.
It's true. And that's why we keep coming back to this idea of the two ways problem, right? It's not enough to just expect Indigenous leaders to do all the adapting.
Exactly. These non-Indigenous systems, these institutions, they've got to do their part too.
Right.
It's about meeting halfway.
Exactly. And that means shifting away from just assimilating. We need to think about genuine collaboration. And both sides need to be open to learning from each other to find solutions that work for everyone.
So how do we do that in a practical sense, I mean? How are these leaders building those bridges?
One of the big things that kept coming up in the study was the importance of, really building those relationships and not just surface level relationships, real genuine ones.
So not just showing up and saying, hey, here's your program, here's the plan.
Nope. It's about going deeper, spending the time to actually listen to people's stories, to understand their needs, to show that you're really committed to them and their community. Like one of the leaders said, they knew my surname, but they didn't know me. People need to know who you are, who's your family. That's how they place you.
Wow. Powerful. So it's about those personal connections, showing you're really invested in the community, because kinship's so important in Indigenous cultures.
Exactly. And that means approaching, time and relationships differently, but building trust, it takes time. You can't rush it. But that can be tough when you're working with organizations that are all about, efficiency and quick results. They're not always patient enough for that relationship building part.
It's like you've got these two different sets of priorities clashing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why cultural competence is so important. It's not just knowing the differences, like on the surface, It's about understanding those deeper values, those ways of being, because that's what shapes how people interact, how they make decisions.
So it goes way beyond just saying the right things or avoiding like those cultural faux pas, right?
Way beyond. It's about truly getting it, respecting another worldview,
Right. And I imagine that's even more crucial for those non-Indigenous organizations that are working with Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. They need to be willing to do things differently, to let go of some of that control, to trust those Indigenous leaders and their expertise.
It's about acknowledging that there are different paths to success,
Yeah,
that sometimes the best solutions, they come from those who are, who are actually closest to the problems, closest to those challenges.
you got it. And that actually leads us to another super interesting aspect of Indigenous leadership, the way they communicate and how they make decisions.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering about that.
It's fascinating, actually. They tend to, well, they describe it as being really patient, careful listening, building consensus. It's not about rushing things.
Right. It's more about bringing everyone together, making sure
Oh.
everyone has a voice at the table.
Yeah, and that they actually feel heard. It's not just, a token thing. Like one leader said, instead I say to the communities, what do you reckon? They like that. They say, you're talking to our elders, our TOs, traditional owners. You want our input. That's the thing with leadership. It puts the ball in their court. It gives them responsibility.
Wow. So they're not just bringing people to the table, they're making sure those voices are actually heard. And then the decisions, they're made together collaboratively.
Exactly. It's such a different way of thinking about leadership than those top-down models. The ones we see all the time in Western organizations. It's more about that collective approach. It's about, that patience, that careful listening, not just forcing a solution on people.
It really highlights how a lot of Indigenous cultures, they place so much importance on, making decisions together
Yeah.
and consulting those elders, those knowledge holders, those community members is part of the process.
It is. And it reminds us that, good leadership isn't about having all the answers yourself. Sometimes the best ideas, they come from, they come from the people who are most affected by those decisions.
That's a good point. And this also connects to something else we've been talking about, this idea of a long-term vision. These leaders, they're not looking for those quick fixes. They're focused on creating change that's gonna last for generations.
Definitely. I
Yeah.
think one of the leaders summed it up perfectly. He said, you're not going to change everything overnight. If I've made a difference to one or two people, it'll have an effect on others. It'll grow. With any program, it might take a generation or two. If we can lay the foundation now, it'll grow.
That is a powerful statement. There's so much wisdom in that. It's a good reminder for all of us, really. Real change, it takes time. It takes patience. And you've got to be committed to that community for the long haul.
Absolutely. It's about playing that long game, nurturing those relationships, having a vision for the future that goes beyond, just those immediate concerns. It's a very different way of thinking than what we're used to.
I think so too. So much of Western leadership, it's about those short-term goals. This research really challenges that.
It really does. It makes you rethink how we measure success. It's not always about those immediate results. Sometimes those really meaningful changes, those impactful changes, they happen gradually through those relationships, those
Yeah.
individual transformations.
It's been such a thought-provoking conversation. This whole idea of Indigenous leadership, it really challenges us to think differently about, what it means to be a good leader.
I agree. It reminds us that leadership is not just about those titles or the position you hold. It's about something bigger. It's about, being of service to others, building bridges, working together to create a world that's more just, more equitable.
Absolutely. And it shows us that we all have so much to learn from Indigenous cultures and those different ways of knowing and leading, especially when we're trying to solve these complex problems.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've talked about so much today. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's this. We've got to listen. Really listen. And we need to be willing to learn from those different perspectives, especially the people who come from backgrounds that are different from our own.
That's so important. We have to let go of those assumptions. We have to be open because everyone has something to teach us, something valuable. And when we work together, collaboratively, we can achieve amazing things.
Exactly. And another thing, it's about building those authentic relationships. It's not just about, checking boxes or hitting targets. It's about those human connections. It's about investing in those connections, working towards something bigger than ourselves.
And finally, I think this research, it reminds us that at its core, leadership is about service.
Yeah.
It's about using whatever skills and influence you have to make a difference. Give back to your community, create a better world, a world where everyone has the opportunity to actually thrive.
I love that. Couldn't have summed it up better myself. This has been such a great conversation, so enriching. And I think it's given us a fresh perspective on what it really means to lead with courage, with compassion, and with respect for everyone.
I agree. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today, but I hope this conversation continues. For all of us, we hope you've enjoyed learning about Indigenous leadership in Australia. And if you're interested in learning more, we'll be sure to, we'll put a link to that research article in the show notes.
Thanks for being with us today.
Until next time, everyone, keep diving deep.